check, check, check. So, Brian, I don't know where folks are, but I'm going to go ahead and get started for our folks at home. So you give me a thumbs up when you are ready for me. We're on? Great. The Lord be with you. It is good to see you this morning. I am excited for this class. This is a little different if you have the Mark Knoll book and have been following along. This is only our second and final departure from the book because today, as I looked at and considered Mark Knoll's book, there was a long period between really the great schism of the church and the Reformation. He skipped from one to the next. There's about 450 years, 475 years between there. And there is not necessarily a big turning point. If you have to summarize it down to 15 chapters and write what is that, an inch and a quarter thick book, it made sense that he didn't delve too deeply into that time period. And yet there's a lot going on. There's some interesting characters that I wanted to focus on. I recommend to you, it's a very short little book, but it's called 4 Women Doctors of the Church. It is by Mary Malone. And we are going to, I had hoped that we would get through all 4 women today, but given all the other things I found and we're going to talk about, we're only talking about 3. So you'll have another one to research a little later. But those 3 women doctors that we're going to talk about are, in order, we'll talk about St. Hildegard of Bingen. Because she is German, speaks German, you will often see her as Hildegard von Bingen, which just means of in German. Catherine of Siena. I've never seen her name put into Italian, but that's okay. And then we'll talk about Teresa de Avila, who is from Spain. So 3 different parts of Europe and 3 different women doctors of the church. So we start off with a song. This is a song in praise of Hildegard, right? So this is to a tune. This is not a traditional song. We're not singing this in worship on a Sunday, but it's still an interesting text, and I thought we could open with it. So this is sung to King's Fold, which is, and I'm just going to speak it here for us. It's, we sing our praise of Hildegard, a woman for all time, a prophetess who urges us to seek the light divine. Her visions came insistently sent by her living light. Anointed with a Spirit's power, she spoke God's truth aright. And there's more here to it, right? We now affirm with Hildegard, we do not live alone, but are a part of all that is, each tree, each bird, each stone. All creatures sing creation's praise, yet we alone possess the power to care for Mother Earth, the power to curse or bless. There's a lot more here, but I love, I found this hymn in one of my many hymnals in my office, and really think it's a good overview of a little bit of what's going on with Hildegard. But before we specifically dive into Hildegard, we've got to answer the question of, well, what is a doctor of a church? So the term, the title doctor of a church has been bestowed by the Roman Catholic Church on now 36 saintly individuals who have been acknowledged for their outstanding interpretation and specifically teaching of Scripture and Christian doctrine. So these are, if you've got this, you've got in the Catholic Church, you've got all the Roman Catholics, everybody who's Catholic, and then you've got the saints, and then you've got a subset of saints who are doctors. So these are not just saints of the saints, but these are specifically special saints who are also known for their teaching ministry. The term first came to be used between 400 and 600, associated with illustrious figures like bishops in the early church. We've seen a lot of these folks before. As of 2020, the Catholic Church had named 36, 17 who died before that great schism, are also held in high esteem by the Eastern Orthodox Church, even though it doesn't use this same title. Among these 36, 27 are from the West, 9 are from the East. You've got 4 women who are all written about in this book, 4 women doctors of the church. 18 bishops, 12 priests, 1 deacon, 3 nuns, 1 consecrated virgin, 26 from Europe, 3 from Africa, and 7 from Asia. And this is another one of them. This is Isidoro of Sevilla, who we almost talked about a couple weeks ago, but we didn't have the time. So very quickly, I'm not going to read all of these, but 4 are from the West, 4 are from the Eastern, the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. We've seen many of these names already. There are 8 other doctors from the patristic period, making 16 fathers who are also recognized as doctors of the church. 11 from the Middle Ages. You have 7 who are prominent in 16th century Catholic Reformation from the Latin Church, and then 2 doctors of the church in the modern era, both from the Latin Church. And you'll see here are the 4 women doctors. And you recognize many of these other names, I sure hope, right? Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, Gregory. We talked about all of them at some point before. So now, one more topic to cover before we delve into Hildegard is the topic of mysticism. So mysticism, quite simply, is an experience of direct access to God, not a theory, but an actual experience. This comes from Mary Malone here. She writes that even though Catherine seemed to be quite unaware of the great women mystics, I'm skipping here. Nope, that's all I wanted to say. Sorry, looking at my notes and I have the wrong thing in front of me. But mysticism is all about having a special experience, direct connection to God that enables one to feel close to God, and also and also someone who shares those experiences. You can have private mystical experiences, but mysticism most often is meant to be shared. And so women, especially in the medieval era, right? Women are not yet. They can't become pastors. They can't preach in any official capacity in the Roman Catholic Church. They still can't in 2021. And they can't yet be missionaries in any form of the word we know it today. So if not ministers, if not missionaries, the other option is mystic. And there we found a lot of women in the medieval era and after who became mystics, who claimed to have this special relationship with God, right? So in the Catholic Church, you think about the hierarchy, it's all, probably women here at the bottom, you've got the men above, then you've got the priests, then you've got the bishops, then you've got, who's at the top? The Pope. And the Pope is the one connecting us to God. Well, here these women come along and say, no, that's great, that's nice, I like the Pope, some days. But I have this direct relationship with God. God is speaking to me, giving me visions. This upends the norm in society. No matter what era, right? These women specifically have these direct experiences of revelation. And you can bet that the men around them were not all too thrilled with their claims. They thought they were often heretics, and they were not pleased. Here we have, this is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, and on the right we have, this is the frontispiece of Scivias, which is a book of Hildegard's, showing Hildegard. This looks like some kind of an octopus attacking her head. I know it's funny for us, but this is how she interpreted her receiving a vision. And she is dictating it to her secretary, Volmar, and she's also sketching here on a wax tablet. So pretty interesting. Let's move on then to Hildegard. So she was born in around 1098. She lived through to 1179. She was born to a noble family at Bermesheim, about 20 kilometers southwest of Mainz. She was made a doctor in the Roman Catholic. Even though she's the oldest, she's one of the more recent of the women doctors. She was only made a doctor of the church in 2012. She had visions from an early age, but also this was paired with a mysterious illness. And we find this sort of a thing with almost every one of the mystics. They have visions from an early age, and they also have some strange medical conditions that we can't quite figure out what they are. But they're still revered enough that people, and their physical conditions, not so much mental conditions, right? Under the direction of Jutta in Dissebodenberg, that's a fun one, isn't it? Dissebodenberg, she becomes a nun, and when Jutta dies, Hildegard becomes the abbess of a small convent. A couple years later, 1147, she experiences a vision that caused her to leave Dissebodenberg and set off to make her own community, solely of nuns, at Rupertsberg near Bingen. And you see Bingen here in the southwest quadrant of modern Germany. This is in the Rhineland. And Hildegard was a cultured woman of wide learning. She did everything. She composed music. She wrote letters, of which we have hundreds of her letters. This is like 1,000 years ago, right? We have hundreds of her letters still today. She wrote texts about medicine and herbalism, but she was best known for her visions, which were set down in writing and illustrated by the nuns of her community. Yeah, illustrated, right? Some beautiful illustrations, strange, apocalyptic, unlike almost anything else. In John Dickson's book, John Dickson quotes someone talking about female mystics and says that Hildegard achieved a level of learning and expression enjoyed by very few in her day, male or female, and her writings show a breadth and originality not found really among any others. Hildegard the scientist is regarded as one of the founders of European pharmaceutical science. Do you expect that? No. She produced 2 books, Causa et Cura and Physica, which was an encyclopedia of birds, beasts, stones, plants, and remedies to illustrate and explain all of her discoveries. Wow. Now, when she was 80 years old, and she's one of the older ones of the mystics, many of the other mystics died younger, but when Hildegard was 80 years old, she was faced with a serious crisis of her life when her convent was placed under interdict, or excommunication. And this meant that for her and her nuns, there would be no liturgies, no singing of the psalms, no public work or writing of any kind. What is Hildegard known for? Writing and music. And they essentially said, you can't do what you'd like to do. Don't do it anymore. What happened? It all happened because of the arrival of an excommunicated criminal who came to the monastery. According to the abbess, he confessed his sins and was reconciled to the church before he died. And so he died, and what do? They bury him in the nuns' cemetery. Well, when Hildegard was then told to exhume the body and produce it for burial outside the church, he's excommunicated, remember? She refused. That's why the interdict ensued. It gave rise to a stream of letters to the local Archbishop of Mainz and to the Pope. The nuns obeyed the interdict to the letter, but found their own ways to worship God. Hildegard was especially outraged that the monastery's singing had been forbidden and prophesied dire punishment from God on those who had so decreed. Eventually, a few months before she died, on the 17th of September, 1179, that interdict was lifted. Okay. One of the most significant words and ideas in the whole corpus of Hildegard is that the word viriditas. Viriditas. If you know any Latin, you know that's not Latin. That's not one Latin word, that's 2. This is the Latin for viridius, which means green, and veritas, which means truth. So she kind of made it up. I wasn't going to talk about this, but her Latin is not that great. It's not her first language, so she does all sorts of interesting things with Latin that people are sometimes confused about, and thank God she has secretaries who correct it, because her Latin is creative, let's say, at best. So this word viriditas, usually translated as greenness. Remember that Hildegard lives in the lush Rhine Valley, and she writes with joy about the gardens and orchards in her monastery home. And for her, the cycle of the seasons, like the rising of the sap giving new life in springtime, was a primary metaphor for the spiritual life. Viriditas signified grace, the all-powerful presence of the Spirit, and the all-pervasive presence of the Trinity. So Hildegard saw aridity, right, dryness, aridity as the main sign of the metaphor for sin, and moistness and greenness is the principal sign of grace in our lives. So we're told that she often concluded her letters with the words, "Stay green and moist." Right? Isn't that just bizarre? But also for her time, that's her thing. That's her thing. For her, that meant openness to the Spirit of God. So I think I might try that in my letters. If you ever get an email from me, maybe stay green and moist. No. Well, yeah, just write viriditas and people will figure it out. Or they'll never figure it out, yeah. Her most well-known work is Scivias. And Scivias, she worked for 10 years to write this. It's the beginning of a trilogy. And this is another one of those ways that Hildegard uses Latin as her own personal expression, because Scivias, it's not up there. And I know there's some tic-tac-toe going on here, but Scivias, or it might actually be pronounced Scivias, but I feel like that's hard to say. So I'm going to just say Scivias. This is one word, but stands for three. It means scito vias Domini, know the ways of the Lord. So it's a history of salvation told through three sections. The first section is all about God the Father, the mystery of creation, the fall, the human race, everything. And throughout, God the Father is the living light. That's why when we were singing before, I talked about the living light. That's God the Father for Hildegard. The second section, also in these visions, speaks of Christ and the work of salvation leading to the founding of the church. And in her vision, Hildegard sees this. Hildegard sees Christ as the man in sapphire blue. And the illustration shows the extraordinary blue human surrounded by the living light, the Father. It's here that she speaks of the importance of baptism as our entry into this light. Hildegard's also profoundly moved by the Eucharist. That's a different topic altogether. And the third and longest section deals with the mystery of the Holy Spirit and how we participate in the mystery of the Spirit. Hildegard speaks of the power of grace and outlines all of the virtues, and in Latin, they all have female names. This is the basis of participation in grace. Patientia, humilitas, prudentia, caritas, and sapientia. Patience, humility, prudence, charity, and wisdom. Or knowledge, yeah. So the development of these virtues in our lives make of us disciples who live with compassion, the surest sign of God's presence in our lives. And the virtues act like the walls of a temple. There's 5 of them, so I guess it's like the Pentagon. Pentagonal temple, but these virtues enclose us in sacred space created by the mystery of the incarnation, the humanity of Jesus. And then Hildegard concludes with the end of time, and the whole of it is illustrated by her visions. We don't quite know, I don't think we know if they are directly illustrated by her or by people around her. I never figured that out. But what did she call it? The man in sapphire blue. So here, we're just going to hear a few words directly from Hildegard and ponder these words. So No creature has meaning without the Word of God. God's Word is in all creation, visible and invisible. The Word is living, being, spirit, all verdant, greening all creativity. This Word flashes out in every creature. This is how the Spirit is in the flesh. The Word is indivisible from God. And then one of her songs here, Song to the Creator. You, all-accomplishing Word of the Father, are the light of primordial daybreak over the spheres. You, the foreknowing mind of divinity, foresaw all your works as you willed them, your prescience hidden in the heart of your power like the wheel around the world, whose circling never began and never slides to an end. Beautiful words, beautiful poetry from Hildegard. There are zillions of these. I am fascinated by Hildegard, and when this class is all over, I've got like 2 more books on Hildegard to go back to because I'm fascinated by her. There's also, if you're saying, I know zero about Hildegard, I want to know more, there's a movie, came out about 10 or 12 years ago called Vision. No surprise there. It's in German with subtitles, but it is superb. I've seen it at least once or twice, and I recommend it. Okay, we move on to Catherine of Siena. On the way up to Thanksgiving in Cleveland, I have to say, I told my brother about the class that I was teaching today. And I was like, Siena, I think it's like north of Rome, because I've never been to Italy, mind you, right? And he said, oh yeah, I've been to Siena. I said, I'm sorry, what? I've been to Siena. And then about 20 minutes later, we're talking to my aunt, and I said, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm talking about, Catherine of Siena. And she said, oh, I love Siena. I said, how is it? Everyone's been to Siena but me. And then I said, well, do you know about Catherine? And both of them looked at me like, who's Catherine? I said, Catherine of Siena. You've got to go back. You've got to go back and visit all of the places known with Catherine of Siena. Anyhow, this is a couple of 100 years later. This is the mid-14th century. And if you look at these dates, Catherine does not live very long, right? She only lives to be about 32. So she died younger than me. She was made a doctor of the Roman Catholic Church back in 1970. So of the 4 women doctors, she is one of the earlier. She and her twin sister Giovanna were the 24th and 25th children of their parents. Whew, right? Right? I almost fell off my chair when I read that. We've got 3, and we're like barely hanging on, right? 25? Unfortunately, her twin sister Giovanna dies shortly after birth. This haunts Catherine for her life. Now, we'll talk more about this in a moment, but the papacy during her life, right? She lived very close to Rome, right? Just right there. We always associate the Catholic Church with Rome, Roman Catholic Church, but there was this strange period of time in the 14th century, we'll talk about more in a moment, where the papacy was not in Rome. The papacy had moved. The seat of Rome was moved to Avignon in France, and that was during her life. And she also lived during the Black Death, right? So, hard life. Now, at the age of 6, she has a vision over the Dominican Church of Jesus, and sees the church wearing a papal tiara. And this vision for her marks a total change in her life. With an extraordinary sense of self-possession and independence, she absolutely refuses to marry. I can imagine after having 24 siblings, you probably don't want that same life. Despite all of her mother's machinations, and besides, she also refuses to become a nun. So if not a wife and mother and not a nun, what's she going to do? Well, in retaliation, her parents appoint her as the family maid. They deprive her of privacy of her room, which she very much craved, and she was coerced into serving the family as any other scullery maid would have done. Eventually, her father sees her at prayer and that changes his mind. He decrees that all this should cease and that Catherine should be allowed to do whatever she wants, whatever she desires. Can you imagine? Even in 2021, right? If as a parent, if you like lay out like, here are some great paths, and then your child's like, I don't want any of those. I'm going to just do my own thing. You're like, what are you? But here, this is like 700 years ago. You had a path or two if you were Catholic, right? Pick one. I don't want them. What are you to do? But her father allowed her to follow her own desires. In her teen years, then, not as the scullery maid, in her teen years, she spends most of her time in total seclusion. She deprives herself almost completely of sleep and food, and her waking life was totally devoted to prayer. Wow. She tells us later about battling with demons. This reminds me of Antony in the desert father, and often crying out in despair to God. But the foundations of her extraordinary life of prayer were laid at this time. At 18, she joins the Mantelate, which is a group of women dedicated to God in the Dominican tradition, but they didn't take any vows. This is a strange, I've never heard of anything like this until Catherine. They're a group of women who are kind of just like, we're a club of people who love God, but we're not going to live together, and we're not going to take any vows. We're just going to maybe hang out. It's kind of like a small group, but I guess that's the best I can figure, because they don't take any vows and they stay in their own homes. They are mostly like virgins or widows, mostly widows as I understand it. At the age of 21, and after a mysterious experience of espousals to Jesus, who had by now become her most intimate friend, Catherine tells us she's instructed by Jesus to leave her solitude. Mind you, for years, she's just sitting in her room. She's not sleeping. She's not eating. There is no TikTok or Facebook. She is just there in prayer. I don't know how she did it. I really don't. It sounds difficult. But she is then instructed, she receives this new vision, this new word from Jesus to leave. Leave that period of solitude. She's done all the preparation she needs, and now she needs to go out. And from that time on, Catherine is rarely alone. Raymond of Capua, who is her confessor and intimate companion, not intimate in that way, from 1374 to 1378, is also her biographer. Raymond tells us that Jesus speaks to her and says, "Leave me now. It's dinner time. Your family are sitting down to the table. Go, join them." And what Malone writes here, she says, the ordinariness of that suggestion from Jesus gives us an idea of the calm intimacy that had developed between Catherine and Jesus. For someone who had relished total solitude, Catherine's eventual gift of friendship is astonishing. She had a horror of selfishness and saw in the sharing and communion of friendship as a foretaste of heaven. Being friendless was, for Catherine, an experience of hell. Okay, so to give you a little more idea of what's going on in Catherine's time, I want to talk to you about what's going on in Europe and what's going on with the popes. So we've got popes, and then we've got anti-popes. An anti-pope, or antipapa, is a person who is in opposition to the legitimately elected pope. He makes a significant attempt to occupy the position of Bishop of Rome and the leader of the Catholic Church. So if you put this into context, right, Mediterranean, right, Roman world all around the Mediterranean, then Islam came in, and we fought with the East, and we said, excommunicated each other. We had all this conflict, and it was just the Roman Catholic Church. They couldn't get along with themselves. And eventually, there started being elected all these anti-popes who were saying, no, I'm the real pope. I'm the real pope. And all this conflict ensued, and it was not pretty. The period in which anti-popes were most numerous was during the struggles between the popes and the Holy Roman Emperors of the 11th and 12th centuries. the emperors frequently imposed their own nominees and said, no, I want him to be the next pope, or the pope at all. And the popes likewise sometimes sponsored rival imperial claimants, anti-kings. Can you believe this? So it's between the church and the state, and they're saying, I don't want you to be in power anymore, I want this other guy. And then they say, I don't want you to be king anymore, I want this other guy. Bizarre. From the early 1150s, let's go back to Hildegard for a minute. Hildegard was engaged in correspondence, voluminous correspondence, much of which we still have, with popes, emperors, abbots, abbesses, that's a funny word, and people from all walks of life. 300 of these letters survive and make astonishing reading in their audacity and firmness. At one time, she had met Emperor Frederick Barbarossa and sought his help, but also berated him for inflicting so much harm on the church, because the emperor was engaged in constant war with the popes. And in the course of Frederick's life, the emperor, he appointed 4 anti-popes to serve his interests. They were elected in opposition to the canonically chosen pope. Then we need to talk just a moment about the Avignon papacy. We've already hinted at this. This is where, instead of the Bishop of Rome, they've moved. And they move from down here all the way whoop to Avignon. You see Siena here, where Catherine's from, a lot closer to Rome. And also in the same modern-day country, at least. Avignon, all the way over here. What's going on? This was the seat of power. Why have we moved? The Avignon papacy is also known as the Babylonian captivity, the period from 1309 to 1376, during which 7 popes resided in Avignon, which was then part of the Kingdom of Arles, the part of the Holy Roman Empire, now in France. So it's not, as best as I can sort out, it's not in a totally different empire. It's not like they've moved over to the Eastern Empire or anything like that. But it's a different kingdom. The situation arose from the conflict between the papacy and the French crown, culminating in the death of Pope Boniface VIII. This is one of the craziest stories I've heard. Boniface VIII was arrested, the Pope was arrested and maltreated by Philip IV of France. Following the further death of Benedict XI, Philip forced a deadlocked conclave to elect the French Clement V in 1305. He refused to move over to Rome, and so in 1309, he moved his court to the papal enclave at Avignon, where it remained for 67 years. This is the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, so it is called. So, did you catch that story there? So, lots of conflict between kings and popes, and an arrest, and essentially mistreatment, which led to death. And I don't like this guy. Let's make this French guy, one of my own people that I can control, let's make him the pope. Well, everyone before when they were pope, where did they go? Boop, they went down to Rome. He said, I don't like going to Rome. I'm French. I want to stay here. So he did. He did. And for 67 years, there were 6 more popes who did the same. So, this papacy had resided in Avignon since 1309, but with Catherine of Siena, this is where we're bringing it back to Catherine, with Catherine of Siena's convincing, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome in 1377. But the Catholic Church split in 1378, the year after, and elected 2 popes. So I do love this story, though, that Catherine is writing with the Pope and says, essentially, you need to move back to Rome. And what does the Pope do? He does. He says, okay, I'll move back to Rome. This reminds me of the relationship between Ambrose and Theodosius, remember? When Ambrose said, "How dare you do that? You can't come to communion, and you need to do X, Y, and Z." And what did the emperor do? He obeyed. He obeyed the Bishop of Rome. Here again, Catherine, who does not have any systemic power at all, Catherine says to the Pope, "You need to move back to Rome." And he says, "Okay, I will." Obviously, it's not that simple, but still pretty interesting. And then, so you've got the Avignon papacy. They move back to Rome, but then there's this schism within the West, this papal schism, also called the Vatican standoff, which splits the Catholic Church for a period of around 50 years, in which bishops residing in both Rome and Avignon are claiming to be the true popes. What? Who's the pope? And then, at a certain point, they are joined by another person from Pisa. Yes, the Leaning Tower of. There's a third line of Pisan popes that come around in 1409. So the schism was driven by personalities, political allegiances, with the Avignon papacy being so closely aligned and associated with the French monarchy. These rival claims to the papal throne damaged the prestige of the office. Now, we're not quite to the Reformation yet, but can you start to see why perhaps people in the Roman Catholic Church are not happy? We've got nobody else to fight with. The East's gone, right? We're not in good relations with them, so we decide to fight amongst ourselves. And here, as you see in this map, there are large swaths of Europe that are dedicated to, or have allegiance to Avignon, the Pope here. Then you've got all these little swaths all over the place dedicated to the one down in Rome. And then you've got, of course, the Eastern Orthodoxy. You've got Islam coming, and then you've got some places in the middle here that are, I'm not sure who are we allied with. So lots of issues. This lays a foundation for what we're going to talk about next week, which is the Reformation. The church, there's major problems in the church, and at the end of this papal schism, which is in 1417, it was 100 years later that Luther, nailed those 95 Theses to the door to say, we need to change or else, essentially. But this is laying some groundwork for all of that. Okay. A little bit more about Catherine. A little more on Catherine. John Dickson writes that I think of Catherine and Hildegard as medieval religious versions of Oprah Winfrey or climate activist Greta Thunberg, women who have little structural authority in society, but whose personal gifts compel the masses and gain the ear of rulers. I love that, right? Catherine and Hildegard are modern-day Oprahs and Gretas. That's a funny comparison, but I think it's helpful to understand the lack of power systemic power that they have, but also how their personality and gifts allow them to speak in ways that no other women were allowed to, even at this time. So for Catherine, almost 400 letters of hers survive, and her longtime confessor Raymond preserved them and wrote the authoritative biography on Catherine. As well as her mystical teachings, Catherine has many practical pieces of advice, such as never let your spiritual devotion come in the way of helping the poor. Do not despise vocal prayer, praying out loud. It is the gateway to the mystery of God's word. Learn as friends always to depend on each other, for being without friends is a foretaste of hell. And then she writes here, never let your... Oh, that's exactly what I said. Well, there you go. Boop. We're only going to get through one of these here, but says, O eternal Trinity, fire and abyss of charity, dissolve this very day the cloud of my body. I am driven to desire in the knowledge of yourself that you have given me in your truth to leave behind the weight of this body of mine and give my life for the glory and praise of your name. For by the light of understanding within your light, I have tasted and seen the depth, eternal Trinity, and the beauty of your creation. Then when I considered myself in you, I saw that I am your image. You have gifted me with power from yourself, eternal Father, and my understanding with your wisdom, such wisdom as is proper to your only begotten Son and the Holy Spirit, who proceeds from you and from your Son, and has given me a will, and so I am able to love. You, eternal Trinity, are the craftsman, and I, your handiwork, have come to know that you are in love with the beauty of what you have made, since you made me a new creation in the blood of your Son. Isn't this beautiful, beautiful words? I love that last. You are the craftsman, I your handiwork. I know you are in love with me, what you have made, since you made me a new creation in the blood of your Son. Beautiful. Okay, we're going to skip this next one. We're going to go on to Spain. We're jumping forward in time here, but lots of things are going on in Spain. And 1492 is a busy year. Not only did Columbus sail the ocean blue, but other things happened too. Wow, that kind of all rhymed, didn't it? So we know, of course, about Columbus, but also the Inquisition. Even though it had started in 1478, for those who had, to identify those heretics who had converted from Judaism and Islam to Catholicism, there was an intensification in 1492 of the royal decrees that quote, was ordering Jews and Muslims to convert to Catholicism or leave Castile, resulting in hundreds of thousands of forced conversions. This reminds me of during Charlemagne's reign. I was trying not to say Constantine. During Charlemagne's reign, right, when he was saying baptism or death, essentially, this is what's going on about 600 years later, 700 years later in Spain. They are forcing these Jews and Muslims to convert to Catholicism or leave. Recall that prior to this period of time, there was this golden age of Spain where there was this convivencia. Everyone was living in Spain together. Jews, Muslims, Christians, they were all relatively peaceful and happy with one another. And then things changed. With all these forced conversions, there was persecution of the conversos, the convert ones, and moriscos, the Moors, and mass expulsions of Jews and Muslims from Spain. And the Inquisition was not definitively abolished until 1834. Yes, I said 1834. Like 350 years. Isabella and Ferdinand finished the Reconquista also in 1492, which had sought to reconquer or reclaim those former Spanish lands from the Muslims. Remember back in 711, at the expansion, the quick, fast expansion of Muslims, especially across the north of Africa, up in through what is like modern-day Turkey and Middle East, Islam exploded. And in 711, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, I should probably do it this way, Strait of Gibraltar into Spain and took over a majority of Spain. So this was in the year 720. All of Spain and modern-day Portugal, except this little teeny tiny bit up here, Asturias, all of this in 720 was part of the Umayyad Caliphate. This was all controlled by Muslims or Moors. A couple hundred years later, you see that they start to gain some more land, and this is 1080. So just around the time of the schism and the Crusades are approaching, you still see Granada down here, Sevilla, and some of these northern places are more traditionally Spanish, right? Just like everywhere we visited in Europe through this class, no place quite looks like it does today. These are all little kingdoms that one day become unified under the crown of Spain. But we have Valencia, Zaragoza, all these little kingdoms. Just 20 years later, the whole thing changes. Portugal comes out of nowhere, right? Nowhere. Boop. You have the Almohad Caliphate. Some things have changed in a couple hundred years. Castile here has grown. Castilla and Leon, right? These are the two major kingdoms that then come to combine and dominate. So this is 1444. And then we know by 1492, everything but Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula, which is this whole thing, this side, everything becomes goes under the crown. And you can still tell that, there's all these kingdoms. Even hundreds of years later, you still in Spain, this is a side thing I'll just go into for a moment here, you still have little dialects because of all these kingdoms and certain allegiances, like the Basque country, which is kind of their own thing and not really represented on this map in any way through all the years. They're up here doing their own thing, and there are a language completely unrelated to any other language isolate. Basque people are still hiding out up here, right? Galicia, all these people still want political independence, right? If you watch the news and they talk about Spain at all, and the news, much of it is about how over here in Barcelona, the Catalonians want their independence. Still, these conflicts are going on. Okay. And then we get to the Inquisition. Ding, ding, ding. There we go. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, if you knew. I'm looking at the clock here. We only have about 10 minutes, and so I'm not going to go into all of this, except to say the Inquisition was terrible, and in normal popular dialogue, the Inquisition gets a very bad rap, probably worse than it should. This comes from John Dixon's Bullies and Saints. He's very honest about the bad things the church has done, which is why I so appreciate his book. But he actually says that the Spanish Inquisition ran some of the most, had some of the best run, most humane courts in Europe, and that the total number of men executed in the entire time of the Inquisition, over about 350 years, was only 5,000 to 6,000. When people talk about, the Christians and the Inquisition, the Inquisition's the worst thing. No, it's not good. It's not the best thing. But if you're going to be a non-Christian and complain about the history of Christianity, complain about the Crusades, not the Inquisition. As it says, some people who were in prison for other crimes would try to prove themselves to be heretics so that they could go to the Inquisition's jail, because those were so nice, right? Bizarre things. And Dixon says the Inquisition executed about 18 people a year. And he says it is 18 too many, but the Spanish Inquisition would hardly register a blip on the radar of a history of human violence. And yet it looms larger in the modern mind than most other examples of cruelty. And then he talks in his book, which I don't go about here, he talks a lot about the 30 Years' War and everything going on, the soon coming French Revolution, all those times, those are secular and very bloody, very violent times. Compared to the Spanish Inquisition, whoa, scary stuff. Spanish Inquisition, barely a blip on the history of human violence. So I thought that was pretty interesting. We move on, at light speed, to Teresa de Avila. So she is here in the 16th century. She's the latest person we're talking about today. 1515 to 1582. And she was made a doctor in the Roman Catholic Church in 1970, right along with Catherine of Siena. She entered the Carmelite convent at the age of 20, and 2 years later, she adopted the name of Teresa de Jesus, Teresa of Jesus, right? She had visions, including one of herself in hell, which motivates her to follow stricter practice of faith, and she founds a new, stricter convent. Throughout her life, she developed this order known as the Discalced Carmelites, which means like barefoot or sockless, and she consecrated 17 of these convents throughout Spain. So here's another map of Spain. Every single one of these red dots is a place where Teresa went, and she started a monastery. Her Teresa's most famous work is known as the Interior Castle. It is a long, mystical book. Maybe I should not say long, but it is complicated. I'll be honest, I've tried to read it. I could not get through it. But it is an attempt to talk about the mystical journey of faith as being something on the inside. And there are 7 mansions, also called dwelling places, and you kind of make this journey from one to the other, and you go deeper and deeper and deeper into the castle. You make this interior journey of mysticism. She already assumed entrance to the first mansions by prayer and meditation, and the first 3 mansions are considered to be active prayer and asceticism. The 4th through the 7th are considered to be mystical or contemplative prayer. She candidly reveals this interior journey as being inseparable from her love for Christ, and that the highest mansions can only be gained by being in a state of grace through the church sacraments, fervent devotion to the soul's will to him, and humbly receiving a love so great it is beyond human capability or description. Through prayer and meditation, the soul is placed in a quiet state to receive God's gifts of contemplation. And Teresa notes that man's efforts, human efforts, cannot achieve that if it is not his divine will. So she is one of the later mystics, and I wish we had more time to talk about her at length, but we do not. I'll say here, she died, interesting little tidbit on her, lots more to her, but she died on October the 4th of 1582. And if you know, that is the exact day when the new Gregorian calendar comes in and replaces the old Julian one. So 11 days were lost this month. Do you know this little tidbit of history? Yeah, 1582, we have to change the calendar by 11 days. So there's no such date as October the 5th of 1582. It doesn't exist in the West. We skip from October the 4th to October the 15th. And that is why, even though she died on October the 4th, that was also October the 15th, and that is her feast day. So interesting, other things going on around the world. And here is one of her most famous prayers and writings. She writes, "Christ has no body now on earth but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours. Yours are the eyes through which is to look out Christ's Yours are the eyes through which is to look out Christ's compassion to the world. Yours are the feet with which he is to go about doing good. Yours are the hands with which he is to bless men now." If you remember a couple of years ago, since this is in Spanish, when we commissioned Catherine Opard, who was going off to seminary, we had a blessing for her. This was the prayer that we spoke over her. We're not going to have time for that. And you're going to hear the next one here in a minute. The other one is Thérèse de Lisieux. She is French. If you're looking at this book and you want to learn a little more, she's also interesting, but she is from the 19th century, late 1800s, far outside of our time frame here. So, as I've said before, well before women could become pastors, serve in the missions field, Christian women might become nuns, but some rose to the notoriety as mystics. Today we talked about Hildegard, who lived a very long time by comparison to the others and did everything. She wrote, she had visions, she had all those visions that were then transferred down into illustrations. She wrote music. She wrote journals of science and medicine, and probably the first pharmaceutical scientist in any way. And interesting woman all around. Catherine of Siena, who had all sorts of other visions. And she also eventually wrote to the Pope and said, you need to move back from Avignon to Rome. And he did. He did. But things weren't as good as they could have been. And then Teresa, who lived in the shadow of Inquisition times in Spain, a lot was changing in the world, but she held on. She held firm, and she kept going. She established many convents and was faithful and true to her understanding of her mission in life, to spread the gospel and to develop nuns throughout Spain. We may have time for like 1 or 2 questions, if we have any, on women mystics. While you're thinking of a good question, next week we're going to talk about start of Protestantism, Luther, Calvin, Henry that should be Henry VIII. It's only Henry VII, not quite. Yeah, any questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead, Dick.
Seems like when we were in Avignon, that palace grounds is very bleak compared to Rome, which has got all kinds of artwork and everything. So I don't know whether they took it out of there or whether it was never there.
Yeah, no, that's a really good. It's hard to know. Yeah, I certainly do not know the exact answer to that, but I would imagine that in the move, there was certainly some things that went from Rome to Avignon, and probably some things that moved back. But they weren't there too long to establish and make it too opulent and extravagant. So, but yeah, that's a really good question. What actually happened to the buildings and the artwork and all those things during the Avignon papacy as well as the Western Schism thereafter? I don't know. Great. Go ahead,
Michael,
Dan.
did we talk about 2 schisms? We talked about the division of Rome, east and west of the Roman Empire, and then we talked about a schism today, which was more the division on the church level.
Correct.
Is this the same thing, or are they 2 different schisms?
2 different schisms. So the earlier schism is what historians say is from 1054. It's the East-West schism. Even though we said, even the last couple of weeks, that's not the perfect date. There's a lot more going on with the Crusades, especially that Fourth Crusade that really puts a wedge between East and West, and things are never the same. That's the East-West schism, the Great Schism. But then once the West is on its own, then we talk about the Western or the Papal Schism, in which the move to Avignon starts this period of unrest for about 150 years, where the popes in Avignon, and then he moves back to Rome, but the people in Avignon said, no, we want our own guy. So there's 2 popes, and then there's 3 popes. There's all this conflict. So there's different times, different periods of schisms. Good question. Thank you, Dan. We're going to finish up with this. You probably know this song. We sing this in Taizé. I sing this every single night to my kids, this song in Spanish here. But this is something that comes from Teresa. This is, let nothing worry or upset you. Whoever has God needs fear nothing. Let nothing worry or upset you. God alone is enough. And so let us go in that reminder that God alone is enough today. Let us go in the peace of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. See you next week.